Hello and welcome to the Blockade Runner podcast. My name is John, and with me today is Ryan.
Good morning.
And we are super happy to be back, not only to doing the Blockade Runner podcast, but to our Power of the 90s series. We are at 1994, and the Power of the 90s series is when Ryan and I break down all of the books, the comics, the games, the movies. There's no movies, but all the comics, books, games, and other media and stuff from the 90s. And our idea, it was really Ryan's idea, which is an awesome one, is to kind of look at each year individually and kind of just talk about everything Star Wars happening in that year. And the 90s were such a great time for Star Wars. And it's a cool thing to kind of go back and say, I kind of look at like what was like the Star Wars culture like in this year of the 90s and like kind of what was going on. And you can sort of see, and we're starting to see this in 1994, which we'll talk about today, but you can kind of see the development of how things were ramping up and how Star Wars was expanding and gearing up for the prequels and all that stuff. So it's really cool. 1994 is the biggest year yet of the 90s, which we would expect. But as far as the 90s go with Star Wars, 94 is the biggest year. There's the most going on in terms of publishing and new stuff coming out. And so our notes for 94 are intense. There's a lot here. So we got to dig in, see if we can get through all this. And we're going to start with our Star Wars novels, as we usually do. And there were 5 novels released in 1994. Which is, quite a few. I mean, even by today's standards, I don't know that we're getting 5 like full on novels per year. Or if we did that, that's probably like the most we're getting at this point. So I think there's only going to be more going on past 94 as far as novels go. But in comparison to, the previous years of the 90s, this is a lot. So the first three we're going to talk about are the Jedi Academy trilogy from Kevin J. Anderson. Ryan, have you read the Jedi Academy trilogy back in the day or anything like that?
No, I haven't actually. And so all 3 books in the trilogy came out in 94.
Yep, all 3 came out in 94. The first one came out in February, I believe we have here. And then the next one, Dark Apprentice. The first one is Jedi Search. The next one is Dark Apprentice, and that one came out, I think, in like summertime. And then, the last one, Champions of the Force, came out in the fall. So,
wow.
Yeah. So I can only imagine that would have been pretty exciting, a pretty cool thing. Back in 94 to have these 3 Star Wars novels featuring Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, Princess Leia, and to get this kind of complete trilogy of stories all in one year. It was probably quite the event, I'm thinking.
Yeah, because these are the books where Luke is training the next generation of Jedi, correct?
Yeah, sort of. He's got a school of some kind, a Jedi Academy. I think it focuses on his relationship with one student mostly, but maybe in Jedi Search, it features more Jedi. Like I said, I haven't actually read these ones. I may have read one of them quite a while ago, but in the 90s. So I don't remember too well. Yeah. But I was looking through the sort of summaries of these, and it sounds pretty cool. I mean, the first one, the big thing that I took away from it is that both Kessel and the Maw are featured. And obviously those are on our minds right now because of Solo, a Star Wars story. So I think that would be fun to go back and read these and kind of see how those things were presented in 94 by Kevin J. Anderson in comparison to like how they're presented in Solo. So, and then in the second book, that's when the second book is Dark Apprentice. And this is when an even greater danger arises at Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy when a brilliant student delves dangerously into the dark side of the Force and unleashes the spirit of an ancient master of the evil order that warped Darth Vader himself. So that sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Was it Ben Solo?
No, it wasn't Ben Solo.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean and that's one of the things, like talking about these books in the context of like the power of the '90s and looking at the '90s and all that stuff.
Mhm.
That's like really cool. Like I'm looking forward to going back and reading some of this stuff from this era before the prequels were. They're actually going to get. I don't know if they're announced yet. I don't think they are announced yet in '94 officially. Um, they start to be worked on in '94, which we'll talk about later. I don't know if they're
Mhm.
announced or not, but anyway, this is a very much a prequel era in terms of like Star Wars fandom and what
Mhm.
people are aware of and what we're kind of like how we're viewing the Star Wars saga, you know.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think now that we know, like we have the canonized official, like it's up on the big screen, like this is what happens with Luke and Leia and Han and
Mhm.
Chewie and, you know, the next threat to the galaxy. Now that all that stuff is really established, I think it would be super cool to go back and look at kind of some of these alternate versions of it that some of these authors kind of put forth. So,
Yeah.
um, but I don't know. I mean, that sounds like a pretty good way to go, doesn't it? For your trilogy of books about Luke Skywalker in the '90s, like there's this ancient Sith evil, and it's like maybe even bigger than Palpatine was, and you know, it's got like it sounds like it has like a kind of a cultish vibe. I know that actually there is like kind of a culty type thing in these three books that is threatening our hero. So I mean, all that stuff I think sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then in the last one, the Champions of the Force. Um, this is the one that I looked at kind of the summary of it and it was like, you know, there's a lot going on here that seems pretty actually similar to the Star Wars sequels that we have. There's a new Jedi school in this book. Well, in this trilogy, obviously. Han and Leia's kids are featured already in '94 in this trilogy of books. So, you know, and then being force sensitive and all that. I mean, that's something we see in the sequels. There's a fallen apprentice who needs to be redeemed, a world destroying weapon, the Sun Crusher. I don't know if you remember the Sun Crusher or not.
Oh man.
Yeah. It can destroy entire solar systems, if that sounds familiar. Yeah, I just think like there's so much stuff in there that we're seeing in our sequel trilogy, but just kind of presented it in a different way, obviously. So,
Yeah.
um, and it doesn't sound as good, but like I said, it would be cool. I think it'd be cool to go back and look at from
Yeah. Yeah.
our lens of having the sequel trilogy. So, anyways, that was no doubt a big event in '94. Unfortunately, neither of us were reading those books at the time,
Mhm.
but yeah, I think they're remembered fondly and would be good to go back and look at some point.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like half a decade later, there'd be the Jedi Academy PC game that would come out. And I wonder how much of that is based on these books as well.
Yeah, I don't know, because that's like Kyle Katarn and stuff, right?
Yeah, it's like more of a Dark Forces Jedi Knight sequel, but I wonder if
Yeah,
they pulled some stuff because they took the name. So,
right on. Yeah, totally.
yeah.
All right. Okay, well, let's talk about the next one. And this is one that you are reading now, or did you finish reading it?
Yeah, I had the best intentions of finishing it before we recorded, and I only got about 100 pages in.
Okay.
But yeah, The Courtship of Princess Leia. This was another novel released in 1994. It's actually a standalone novel. It's not part of any trilogy or duology or anything else. But John, you said you read this back in the day.
I think I did. Yeah, I think I did. I know I read the next book on our list back in the day. I think I read this one too, although I'm looking at like your bullet points here and thinking like, oh, wait, what is this book? And did I actually read it? So maybe I didn't, but I thought so. The Rockford Public Library, Ryan, had a pretty solid selection of Star Wars books, and I think I read most of them at the time. So this is one where whenever I heard the title, I was like, yeah, I remember reading that book, but I'm not so sure now that I'm looking at this stuff about 64 planets and Prince Isolder and all this stuff. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's kind of insane. And man, like this is one of those things that I've really I'm able to enjoy it a lot more now than I think I would have enjoyed it even like 5 years ago. Um, but especially like this really ties into what we were talking about, I think 2 episodes ago, about canon and about legends and kind of coming to terms with perhaps unreliable narrators retelling the events in Star Wars that happened so long ago and so far away. Like, you know, it's hard to get a clear picture on these things. But yeah, this book is something else. So kind of the plot is that you know, Leia is, and this is like post Return of the Jedi, post Thrawn trilogy, actually. And yeah, I believe it's post Thrawn trilogy, because I think it's 5 years after Return of the Jedi, and the Timothy Zahn books, they happen like right after Return of the Jedi, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, we're not experts on either trilogy, or I mean on the Thrawn trilogy or these ones, but yeah.
Yeah. So it's about 5 years after Return of the Jedi, and a race of people called Hapes, Happies, I don't know. They like govern a like group of planets. There's like 63 or 64 of them, and they come to Leia, who's working as, you know, I'm not sure what her official role is. Like, she's still like a princess, considered a princess, but she's definitely like a diplomatic figure in the New Republic. And so these people come to her and offer her assistance in defeating like the remnants of the Empire, and there's like this new threat of like warlords popping up in different areas. And so they have like, you know, 64 planets at their disposal, and like they have all these resources and wealth, and they offer to, you know, lend her their assistance, but only if she marries the queen's son, who is like the prince of these lands. So basically, at this point, it becomes the Spin Doctor's song, Two Princes, and Leia is forced to choose between this really handsome, wealthy prince or Han Solo, which is kind of weird because this is definitely taking place like, you know, X amount of years after Return of the Jedi. And, you know, I kind of felt like at the end of Return of the Jedi that she had sort of made that choice.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Like there wasn't really anything like up for debate at that point. And I think that's kind of how Han feels as well. But it's really weird because like Leia is like smitten with this Prince Isolde, and so like, and all his wealth, and he's like super handsome and all this, and so like Han goes off and wins her a planet in a sabacc game, and like he like is so stoked on this and like brings it to her, and she's like, oh, that's so sweet, but that's not gonna work because this planet is in this warlord's territory, so it's kind of worthless to me. And so that's really interesting. And also there is something that the Hapes bring to the New Republic, and it is the Gun of Command, which is a gun that when you shoot someone with it, it makes them like susceptible to suggestion. and it kind of makes them like do whatever you want them to do. So Han uses the gun of command to.
No, I was hoping this is not where it was going.
Yeah, to
No.
essentially kidnap Leia. And to get her away from this prince. And there's also, and you know, I don't know how this, like I said, I only read like the first 100 pages, so I don't know how this all shakes out, and maybe it does in a way that is really satisfying
and gives Leia actual agency as well.
Yeah, like this is very different than the general Leia that we've kind of become accustomed to, because she's kind of portrayed just as this like flippant young girl who's like trying to choose between these two dudes and is like, I'll make up my own mind, and like going back and forth and like flirting with both of them and kissing both of them, and it's like, it's not my favorite Leia portrayal. But there's also some revelations about Han's lineage, that he's actually descended from a great king of Corellia, which is a little weird, and really at odds with you know, what we just witnessed in Solo. But yeah, it's it reads and flows really well. Like I actually enjoy the experience of reading it, but there's just so much stuff that I'm like, whoa, really? Like but I mean, it's, you know, it's 1994. Like you were just saying, we don't even have like the prequels yet. So this was like really uncharted territory, and I know people like in this era were probably like not even sure that, you know, how long Star Wars would last, if it was just like a passing fad again, and they just kind of swung for the fences. And I don't think there was as much scrutiny put into
oh yeah, definitely not.
This at the time there wasn't a story group or anything, and even just like, even outside of continuity, just like characterization, because like, yeah, I can't really see Han Solo kidnapping Leia, like that's in any way.
Yeah. I feel like this era was more like, if you were an author and you wanted to write Star Wars and you had a pitch, you know, that you could bring to like Lucasfilm Publishing and like, here's my idea. It's like, okay, that's cool, go for it, you know. And so which is, I mean, that's kind of, in a way I like that, because you just probably get like a variety of Star Wars stories. And if you're not really think of them as necessarily being all, you know, canon or whatever, it's just like, hey, here's a toy box full of characters that authors can play with. I mean, I know that you know, there was more connection than that. I mean, they did try to keep it more, you know, consistent than just like do whatever you want. But yeah, I think rather than having it sort of all this one kind of thing, there was a little more variety, just because it was like people could do kind of their version of things to a certain extent. So, but yeah, I don't know. That sounds pretty bananas. It's funny to me too, because like I'm hearing you talk about like, oh, we found out that Han's actually a prince, you know, and I'm like, it's so funny because like not the context, but like the medium, and then also the time period in which this stuff is released, I think factors so heavily into whether or not I think it's fun or I think it's like bad. Because like if you were like, oh, this book came out in like 1979, or it came out in 1979 and it was a comic book or something, I'd be like, oh, that's such a zany, fun sort of thing, you know. But then, or if it came out in the mid 80s, I'm like, well, you know, it was the Wild West, it was the 80s, there was no like Star Wars publishing thing really happening, it's like whatever. But then I feel like now, even in the 90s, like as we move closer and closer to, you know, contemporary Star Wars, fandom, or maybe just like closer and closer to when I got into like Star Wars, like big time. I'm like, no, I don't want Han to be like a prince from some of that. Like, I want it to get as it gets closer and closer to now, or closer and closer to like the mid to late 90s, which is when I became a big Star Wars fan. That's when I like want all the sort of crazy stuff that doesn't really fit to kind of get to start, being reduced. Yeah. But I guess that's just like kind of my personal perspective. And with it being Legends now, I guess it doesn't really matter, because you can always just go back and read this stuff and be like, well, this is like a what if, or what do you call it in comics? Like an Infinities, or like a I don't know, alternate universe type thing,
Mm-hmm.
where you start on page 1 with the understanding like this is just a different possibility of how things could have been, but it's not how they are, in the actual canon.
And I still just like, I really like the idea that we talked about a few episodes ago, and like what Delilah Stossam was talking about, how there's these are history texts, and they may have been written by unreliable narrators.
Sure.
Like, maybe this is how Prince Isildur felt when he like got there, and like Leia turned him down immediately, which is what I think would happen, because she was already with Han. And so he's like bitter about this, and he wrote this text to say, how gentlemanly he was, and how he made out with Leia, and then Han kidnapped her, and like maybe that's where that's the place it comes from.
Yeah.
Is just a fun way to think about this stuff.
Sure.
I'm totally at peace with it. And it does actually, what's really great about this book though is like there's so many ideas that kind of bloom in this book. And I actually did a little bit of research, and like a lot of things are kind of mentioned for the first time here that would actually become canon. There's talk about, and this is 1994, there's talk about how the New Republic was like the Old Republic, I guess, was like overthrown by what would become the Empire, and they like hunted down Jedi, which obviously is what we got in episode 3. And there's also mention of Dathomir.
Dathomir. Yep.
Dathomir. Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. I like when I actually say some of this stuff out loud, I'm like, wait, is that even a word? But there's mention like that planet plays a huge role in it. And there are these witches of Dathomir in the book. These, and that I'm sure is what the Night Sisters in the Clone Wars.
Oh yeah.
And that whole Maul arc and Savage Opress and all of that. Like, I guess that's what that's all based on. So,
it would be interesting to see kind of how that happened. You know what I mean? Like, who brought that concept into the Clone Wars? Because I don't think it would have been George, but maybe the author. Who's the author of the Courtship of Princess Leia?
Like Dave Wolferton.
Oh, it's a man who wrote the Princess Leia book. Okay, great. No, but I was gonna say, like, maybe George kind of brought that Dathomir thing to that author, but I kind of doubt it though, because I don't think he was too involved with any of this stuff. So, but I'd be surprised if George, when they were putting together the Clone Wars and introducing the Witches of Dathomir and all that stuff, was like, well, let's go back to the Courtship of Princess Leia and pull out the Witches of, so. Yeah. We'll have to see, like, as we follow the 90s here over the next however long it takes us to get through the 90s, to see if some of these concepts pop up again, and where George might have pulled that stuff, or Dave Filoni, or whoever did.
Yeah. Just a couple more things on this book before we move on. I like the book ends with obviously Leia choosing Han.
Yeah.
And I believe it ends with their marriage. So that's something that's interesting. And I feel like this is a story that will eventually be retold in the like quote unquote new canon. And I wonder how it's going to like play out. I could see it being more of like the courtship of Princess Leia being like, you know, her and Han's relationship post Return of the Jedi, which I would actually like to get more info about. Like,
yeah, I mean, yeah, that would be good for sure. Although I have to say, like after reading Last Shot last month, they kind of brush over that like very quickly after the Battle of Endor, like Han, you know, and Leia got married and Leia was pregnant, and they just make it kind of seem like it just happened really like basically. And it's funny because you were like, oh, I kind of felt like at the end of Return of the Jedi she had chosen. I feel like Last Shot and some of the other stuff, like when it's referenced in the new canon, almost kind of makes it feel like they had basically made a lifetime commitment to one another right there on Endor. You know what I mean? Like it was kind of, the deal was sealed there. So I can't really see them revisiting a story about her having to choose between Han and somebody else.
No, I don't think it would be that way. But yeah, like in Last Shot, like all those kind of glimpses into their marriage and like young Ben and stuff, like I think that is such a fascinating time. And maybe there won't be anything about like the courtship or whatever, but
it needs to be Claudia Gray, I think, if it is like
yes, absolutely. But yeah, like I still really just want the book where do things go wrong with them? Where's the point where Han goes off to be a smuggler and you know, Leia goes off to be a general and Ben is Ben? I
think, well, yeah, I don't know. We'll have to talk about that with some other
post episode.
I believe it's not until around the time that, you know, Ben turns to the dark side and all that stuff, right? Like, oh, well, no, maybe not that. Okay. Anyway, it's at least not until they send him off to Luke's academy and all that stuff, I think. But okay, one more novel, and then we're going to jump into some other books from the era. But one more novel is The Crystal Star, and this one I've definitely read, and I really liked it at the time. And I feel like this one, maybe if I'm remembering, maybe it's The Courtship of Princess Leia that I'm thinking of, but I feel like it doesn't have that good of a reputation with like Star Wars legends and fans and stuff like that. But I liked it at the time, and I feel like the story is a pretty compelling idea because basically the Solo Skywalker children have been kidnapped at the start of this book, and Leia and Chewie and R2 try to track down the kids, and at the same time Han and Luke, who are cut off from Leia when some star dies, which I think is like the you know, titular star there, the crystal star, it dies, and then they're like, it like interrupts their force connection, because you're thinking like, why is Han Solo not like trying to find his kids or whatever at the time? But it's what it seems like, based on like the summary and stuff, is that like Han and Luke are off on their, you know, adventure. Leia and Chewie and R2 are going after the kids. And like Luke and Han end up finding like this weird cult guy named Waru, who's got like a following, and he's got like healing powers supposedly. And they're like, you know, uncovering the truth about his cult, and maybe it's more than what it seems like when they first find this guy, and maybe there's something more sinister going on. And then Leia's trying to find the kids. So I don't know, I just thought like it was a pretty cool kind of you had like these two parallel stories going on, and obviously they're gonna like, those two paths are gonna probably connect at the end of the book, and you know, everything's probably all part of one larger sinister plan. But I just, first off, I mean, Han and Luke together adventuring, obviously that's something people wanted to see in the sequel trilogy movies. We didn't get that, which I think is ultimately the right call. But this stuff is out there, if you want to read stories about those two guys, adventuring together and stuff like that. And then also Leia has like a very high stakes, kind of story of her own. And I don't know. I think of all the books we've talked about today, this one actually sounds the most interesting to me to go back and read. So, and like I said, I liked it a lot at the time. So it's the 5th Star Wars novel published in 1994.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And one more thing about the novels before we move on. One thing I'm noticing that I think will be a continuing trend throughout the 90s here with Star Wars publishing is there are the Drew Struzan cover art, like books that have Drew Struzan cover art, and there are they don't have Drew Struzan cover art books. And there's a pretty marked difference, I feel like. If you look at the covers of the Jedi Academy books, they don't look as good as like the cover of the Crystal Star here, which has like a really great cover, actually.
Yeah, I was reading about the Courtship of Princess Leia, and apparently they like the cover looked like a romance novel, and because it kind of is, and it didn't do quite as well as they had hoped. So they put a new cover on it to make it look more action focused. And on one of the covers, because I think it was the re-release, the new cover, it said that they needed a picture of like Han Solo, so they took like a picture of Harrison Ford from Blade Runner and just put it on there.
As you would, sure.
Which is pretty great. So
wow, yeah. Well, I'm a pretty big fan of the Drew Struzan book novel covers for sure. So okay, so those are the 5 Star Wars novels from 94. Let's jump into the reference and nonfiction books from 94, which I think are, potentially even more exciting. And we're going to start with a guide to the Star Wars universe. And Ryan, I got so excited when we were texting and putting together the notes for the show when I realized that this book came out in 1994, A Guide to the Star Wars Universe. Now, what's interesting is that there was a guide to the Star Wars universe that came out in 1984, and that's the first edition. And I don't have that one, but it is in my Amazon cart as we speak. But this is the second, the revised and expanded edition of A Guide to the Star Wars Universe. Man, just like the cover, I know that like looking at the cover of this book, it's like, dude, I looked at this book, I read this book over and over and had it with me all the time in the 90s. Like I loved this book, and we took like the content in this book so seriously, and it was like, oh, you want to know about Star Wars? It's in here. Like, we know everything we need to know. We've got like the Bible, the Star Wars Bible right here. Like we've got it all. And it's hilarious now actually to think that it's a great book. I love it. It's really cool, but there's so much stuff in here that you would read now and just be like, oh, okay. Not at all. But at the time it was amazing. So, and it's still a great book. It's just, a lot of the information has changed at this point. But this one is written by Bill Slavichek. It's called A Guide to the Star Wars Universe, From Airspeeders to Zorba the Hutt and Beyond. Everything you need to know about the expanding universe of Star Wars. Man.
Zorba the Hutt. Mm-hmm. That's our guy from the Glove of Darth Vader books.
Yeah. Which is a sad thing about 1994 is that there's no more books in that series coming out. But so this book is amazing. A couple things I want to point out about it. Number one, like it's lightly illustrated, which is cool. So it's mainly like an encyclopedia, or it is basically an encyclopedia. Although obviously this is before Steve Sansweet's Star Wars Encyclopedia came out. Just a similar concept, but this one is more text heavy. I think there's more images and stuff in that one, but it has like just like a list of different things like droid names and types and names of characters from the Star Wars universe and battles, wars, and historical events from the Star Wars universe and all that kind of stuff. This one's good. Terminology, slang, colloquialisms, and other abstractions. That's a pretty good list there. So all this stuff is in the beginning. And then after that, it's just like A to Z entries about, stuff from all over the Star Wars universe. So pretty great. But it covers stuff from obviously like the movies, the novels, the TV movies and TV specials. So like Ewoks and Droids and the Ewoks cartoon. It's got stuff from the comics, the role-playing games, even the NPR radio dramatizations, like everything that was out basically to that point. Although I was trying to look up some of the stuff like Witches of Dathomir and, the Haps or whatever. And that stuff's not in here. Obviously, I think, because the book came out in 94, those books came out in 94, like kind of probably that stuff hadn't been published yet or not in time for it to be included in this book. So yeah, it's pretty incredible. But the other thing I wanted to point out, which is cool too, is that every entry in the book, in the like encyclopedia part of the book, which is, the majority of it, has either just like a plain rebel insignia like this one, next to it, or it has like what I think is basically like the New Republic rebel insignia, like post Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
And those are to indicate, according to the book, if those are original Lucasfilm sources. So original Lucasfilm sources would be obviously the movies, the scripts, the novelizations, the radio dramas. Those are original Lucasfilm sources. Or if it has the New Alliance symbol, New Republic symbol, it indicates that the information is drawn from an officially licensed source that may or may not agree with George Lucas's vision of the Star Wars galaxy. So that was always cool too, like looking through this book in the 90s and like finding information and saying like, okay, now, is it from, like, it would tell you like that came from the movie or it didn't. And some of them, if there's like a really long kind of like chunk of information, it'll show you like a couple paragraphs and it'll have the rebel symbol next to it, and then a couple paragraphs that have the New Republic or symbol to kind of indicate like, well, some of this stuff comes from George, but then there's stuff that comes, not from George too. So it's kind of awesome. It's like the best. It was the best at the time. I loved it. So but also, I thought I would just pull out. I have two little like pages I wanted to read from here. Okay, number one. This is like the one that we would talk about all the time. I remember back in this era. Page 336, the Owen Lars entry. Owen Lars was a moisture farmer on the planet Tatooine. He and his wife Beru were the guardians of Luke Skywalker. Luke believed that Owen was his natural uncle, but in fact, the man was Ben Kenobi's brother. Kenobi gave Luke into Owen's care right after Luke was born. Owen and his wife were killed by Imperial stormtroopers as they searched for R2 and the secret data stored in the droid's memory. And then in brackets afterwards, it says SW, RJ. So, we know where that information came from. The following entry on page 336 is Aurus. An Aurus is a large, harmless, blob-like creature that inhabits the forests of Endor's moon. And then in brackets, it says ETV. So that's from the Ewoks TV show. So that's the kind of book we're looking at here. We've got like straight up like a major character, well, pretty important character from the Star Wars saga. And like, this is straight from, Star Wars and Return of the Jedi to, an entry about an Ewok character. Whatever. So, and obviously like the Owen Lars stuff is like something that changed. And I remember, we just like, we had it committed to memory. Like Owen Lars is Obi-Wan's brother, and I remember like, I think even all through the prequel trilogy, I kept thinking, or we would talk about like, is it going to be revealed that, that it's Obi-Wan's brother? And I don't know, but anyway, A Guide to the Star Wars Universe. This is like the coolest book. And even now to track this down, there's 3 editions of it. There's another one that came out in 2000. So I got to pick that one up too. Just to have like a reference book of like, what was like the Star Wars story and what was the Star Wars universe like in 1994 in comparison to now, because Obi-Wan is not Owen's brother anymore. You know what I mean? And there's just tons of stuff like that throughout the book. So, I guess if you didn't read it at the time, it would be hard to have as much excitement about a guide to the Star Wars universe as I do. But man, there are a few books that I have loved more than this one. So
yeah, and that's one I never owned or never read. But man, like that cover in particular, that second edition, like that was just always there when I was like looking at Star Wars books in like the 90s. And yeah, I just remember seeing it around so much.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. I think it was pretty important to a lot of Star Wars fans, like in that era, you know. So, but the other book I wanted to point out from this time period, a reference book, or what do you want to say, is The Art of Star Wars. And this is a book that was published in '79, I think. Yeah. So it's a re-release of that, and so I almost thought, like, well, we don't need to talk about this because it's really a book from '79. This is the '90s. You know, we don't need to talk about it. But I think you can tell by looking at like the cover of it, and just like the branding and stuff, the fonts, all that. Like, this is that era when, and actually, this is cool to point out too, on the back, at the top, it says Classic Star Wars, you know. And I think this is like that period of time. Like, obviously, you know, one of the reasons we're doing the Power of the 90s series is because like Star Wars was coming back in a big way in the 90s. It had been dormant for a while, and now they were like making this push. And you know, you can really see that here with like sort of celebrating the original trilogy and re-releasing some of this stuff from this time. And it, you know, even though they're not talking really about the prequels yet, you know, there is like at this period of time, like this sort of like organization or classification of Star Wars. Like, hey, you had this great period of time, like when Star Wars was established in the late '70s to, you know, the mid '80s. That's like an era of Star Wars. Now we're starting this new era. We've got all these books and games and whatever, but you could kind of feel, I think, that there was like the next era, you know, of Star Wars on the way too. So that part of it I like. Whenever I see stuff that's got like that mid 90s branding to it, and it's an original trilogy thing, that's always like a really cool feeling. It just reminds me of that time when Star Wars was starting to get pushed again. And pretty important to me because I wasn't, like I said, a huge Star Wars fan before that. And this push to like reintroduce it to the public consciousness, or like, I don't think it ever went away completely, but like to sort of make it a living thing again, is a big part of what got me into being a Star Wars fan. And the other thing I want to talk about with this book too, just because we have talked a bunch about the modern art of Star Wars books on this podcast. And this one is really different from the ones that come out now, which, you know, and it makes me, I mean, this is really cool and I like it, but it also makes me really appreciate the new ones, because essentially what this is like an annotated script. It has the entire script of A New Hope in there. And then just like images that correspond to the script, accompanying it. And then, you know, there'll be like 2-3 pages of script with images, and then there'll be 4 or 5 pages with like no text from the script and just, you know, images and stuff. So there is plenty of you know, content in here that's just art. You know what I mean? It's not like only, I guess it sort of undersells it to say, oh, it's just an annotated script with some images, because it is as focused or more focused on the images than it is the script. But it's not telling a narrative of like the production and how pre-production moved into production and post-production. And, you know, it doesn't really highlight the designers and artists in the same way that the new books do. So it's just a really different thing. Like, I mean, it gives credit to those people in terms of like every, you know, product or every piece of art, you know, an author or artist is attributed to it. So it's not like it's like not giving credit, but it's not telling those people's stories. It doesn't have, you know, interviews and quotes from those people. And it's not talking about like the development process and the thought process and the creative process of putting the stuff together in the way that the new ones do. So it is interesting in that regard, in the way that it's different from the modern books. And then the other two sides, so that's like the bulk of the book, but then section 2 and 3 Section 2 is like the poster art and promotional art from Star Wars, which that I love. And that would be something they really couldn't do that in the modern art of books because they come out like the day the movie comes out. But this one's a little more like retrospective, like looking at the entirety of the art associated with that movie. So including like the poster art and stuff. And I like that. But then also at the end of the book in section 3, there is fan art and art from like professional artists and stuff too that have made stuff like those like parodies, like comics and things like that, like, you know, newspaper comics and things like that. But then there's also fan drawings, and a lot of them are from like little kids. So that's pretty great too. Like in the art of Star Wars, there's just
oh my god,
yeah, kids drawings and stuff. Like, and there's probably like 5 pages of that. Yeah. Like say one of them's a letter even, like yeah, you'd have to look at it, but it's pretty great.
Wow.
Yeah, Brian McGoldrick wrote this letter on March 14th, 1979. He lived in San Jose, California. And he wrote to the Star Wars fan club, and at the bottom he drew some of his favorite Star Wars characters. So
oh my god, that is a great Jawa.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, yep. So very cool that this was kind of re-released in the 90s and 94. Like I said, as part of a push to bring Star Wars back into the consciousness and sort of say like, what can we draw from the past that would be good to put out there and get back into people's consciousness now. Yeah, it's great. It's a soft cover book, you know. I actually have it because Kevin pushed it my way, passed it along to me, so that was cool of Kevin to do. But yeah.
Nice.
Yep. So lots of books, man. We're like almost an hour in, and we've only talked about novels and reference books from 94. So we better keep moving.
Yeah.
West End Games, the RPG publishers, who, by the way, Bill Slavichek, who is the author of Guide to the Star Wars Universe. I don't know if you saw in the notes there, but yeah, West End Games, TSR, Wizards of the Coast, worked for all those companies. So he was like a role-playing guy, which makes sense because there's so much content in those source books that would need to be that you'd need to know to do one of these. So but anyway, there's just one source book I think released in 94 as far as I can tell, which is the Last Command source book, and would be one based on the final book in the Heirs of the Empire series. So that one came out in 94, but then also, this is crazy to me. I did not know about this, and so want to track some of these down. West End was also started to publish in 94, the Star Wars Adventures Journal, which is a role-playing magazine, like I said, published by West End Games. And they published 4 issues total in 94. It seems like it had, I don't, do you know what this would, like, what would this be, Ryan? What's a role-playing magazine? Were there like D&D magazines?
Well, I mean, there was Dragon, which was the big one. And basically in like a role-playing game magazine, like you'd have, you might have like different rules sets, different ways to play. There might be like a module in there like that you could play with your role-playing group, or a few modules. There might be some like, you know, lore in there that you could use to kind of, you know, spruce up the game you're playing with your group. Maybe interviews with designers and like what's coming next, and then like hyping the next books.
Okay. Well, yeah. That sounds.
You could definitely fill a magazine. I mean, Dragon went on for years and years.
Yeah, well, and apparently this first issue of Star Wars Adventures Journal is 288 pages long. I would imagine they're not all that long, but I don't know.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so I don't know if these are expensive to track down now or what, but I would love to have a couple of those in the collection for sure. So, yeah. All right. So that's what was going on with Star Wars publishing as far as books go in 1994. Let's talk about comics.
Yeah.
This is kind of more your forte, Ryan.
Sure.
But looks like 4 different Star Wars comic series going on in the 90s.
Yeah.
In the 90s, more than the 90s. In 94, 4 different
Yeah.
Star Wars comics. Yeah. So let's talk about those. What is Droids?
So Droids is I guess it's kind of like a reboot of the comics about droids. And these are the Dark Horse. We're in like the Dark Horse era now. We're post Marvel. But like there was originally a Droids comic that was based on the cartoon.
Right.
And that's really weird. I actually I have an anthology of some Droids comics and some Ewoks comics, and they're all based on the cartoon, and they're all insane and like so ridiculous. They're for kids, like real young kids. But this is like a more serious, more of like that Dark Horse style of Star Wars comics. I've, I had some issues of this, or I still have, but I haven't really revisited this series in many, many years. But it is more of that like Dark Horse vein of Droids comics.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the cover of Star Wars Droids, the Kalarba Adventures #3, and it features C-3PO with like an angry look on his face, holding like a blaster rifle, like in the direction of the viewer. And I'm like, whoa, this is more of a intense C-3PO than we're used to for sure. So yeah, I can see where it's a little more of that Dark Horse vibe.
Yeah. Very, very different than the Marvel Droids comics.
Yeah.
So the other things released this year were, again, like you said, they're bringing back like, hey, this is classic Star Wars. This is the original trilogy, and they had. Classic Star Wars #1, which is I would assume is a reprint of Marvel Comics Star Wars #1, which came out in, I think, 77 or 78 for the first issue of the Marvel books, because I think the first 4 issues of the Marvel line were the retelling of A New Hope. And so this is a reprint of that. It's beginning to reprint those issues under the Dark Horse banner. Something that I just finally, we've talked about this before, but like I'm just finally digging into now, are the classic Star Wars, the early adventures, which are reprints of the comic strips from 1979, 1980. And I believe that the comic strips they're referring to here, I don't actually have any of these issues, but the Star Wars, the early adventures would be the Rex Manning strips and newspaper strips. And I actually or Russ Manning, not Rex Manning Day. But a different kind of empire. So yeah, I just recently, and if you're watching the video version, got this newspaper strips volume 1 epic collection at a sale at my one of my local comic shops, and it has those strips here.
Yeah.
And I think they're the reprinted. These are obviously like recolored, and I'm not sure if, I wouldn't say recolored, but they're like really touched up and stuff. And I'm not sure exactly what the strips look like in these, single floppy comics that came out at the time. But this book, like, these are absolutely gorgeous. These newspaper strips, reprinted in this Marvel Epic collection, and they're like the artwork is insanely good. And it was just one dude doing these. Like, he did the writing, the pencils, and the colors for these newspaper strips, Russ Manning, and like they are just incredible looking. Like, I mean, it's kind of above and beyond what you'd expect to see in a newspaper strip. Like, there's so much detail in every panel. And yeah, I've read a few of these, and they're really fun, and really weird, as all Star Wars stuff from the late 70s, early 80s are. And pulling influences from all over the place, which may or may not be what George intended with stuff, but I think they're really cool. And like, the actual likenesses of the characters from the films are great. So these are lovely, lovely comics. And it's cool that once Dark Horse got that Star Wars license, that they would hold basically from the early 90s all the way to the essentially the Disney buyout, that they like did go back and kind of take whatever had come before, to make it more accessible for people.
Yeah, and again, I think it's just like, this is the first couple of years of like, hey, Star Wars is back, and we've got a bunch of new stuff coming out, but also let's celebrate and re-release like some of the stuff from the past too, to kind of get Star Wars fever stoked again, in the hearts and minds of fans in the mid 90s here. So yeah, it would be cool to track down some of those issues from then, just to see kind of how they were collected and presented then in 94.
Yeah.
But also, I think too, like something I've been meaning to get, which are, available now up on Amazon or wherever, are the Star Wars, the classic newspaper comics volumes from IDW.
The hardcovers.
Yes. Yeah. So, and I know I listened to an interview with the editor of those, which is, what's his name? Rich Hanley, I think. I just had it here. But anyway, talking about how they put these together, and kind of sounds like the best kind of way to pick these up. There's 2 volumes that are out now, and one more volume at least coming out later this year. So those are up on Amazon. Nice big hardcover editions, and they're only about $32 right now for each kind of collection. Yes, so been meaning to pick those up. Hopefully I'll grab those soon, because just like in the 90s, just like in 94, there is so much Star Wars stuff coming out. It's definitely difficult to keep up with all of it, but
yeah,
those would be great to get. Cool. All right. Oh, well, we still have Tales of the Jedi to talk about too, right?
Yes. Dark Lords of the Sith. I'm not actually sure what this is. I assume, I'm thinking it's maybe that Old Republic era, because that's kind of what Knights of the Old Republic that fell under this Tales of the Jedi banner. So I'm thinking this is a prequel. But I'm not actually sure. I'm not familiar with this arc. So
yeah, I'm looking at some stuff about it on Wikipedia here now, and these seem to be set in the year 3998 BBY. So what's that, like almost 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin?
Okay.
So yep, definitely in that era, and interestingly, features a battle on Onderon, which is a planet that's talked about, later on, like in the Clone Wars and stuff. And it was definitely part of like the whole Star Wars, canon and everything. And then, yeah, just like lookks like Jedi versus Sith magic, Jedi war, blah, 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 that whole thing from that era. So I shouldn't say blah, blah, blah dismissively. I just mean like, we've heard about like, it's kind of what you'd expect, like, bunch of Jedi fighting a bunch of Sith. There's some supernatural elements to it, and you know, I'm looking at a cover here. This definitely has that Dark Horse vibe. Everything looks very I don't know what's the word here. Very intense, very kind of mature. The faces look a little more angry than you're used to with Star Wars covers, I feel like. So
yeah,
it's got that vibe going for sure. But people love Tales of the Jedi. I know these are like really well liked, and yeah, must have been pretty awesome at the time.
Yeah, and I think like it really can't be understated, like Dark Horse's contribution to bringing back Star Wars, because remember, this was like 90s comic boom time. Like we are just like on the cusp of the image revolution. You know, there's like, you know, X-Men #1, Death of Superman, like all this stuff is happening. Like comics are like the biggest they've been in forever. And you know, like 90s comics, like they do have like an edgelord vibe to them, but like Dark Horse did such a good job like kind of capturing that, and but like making it fit with Star Wars. Like these books, like they look as good as anything like Marvel or DC's putting out, but they're Star Wars, which is, and you know, they continued that the whole run. Like they really had like super high standards, and they kind of captured the essence of like the zeitgeist of that time. And I think that's really cool, because that probably you know, brought a lot of people back to the Star Wars fold, or you know, people who were frequenting comic shops at this time, like, oh, I've heard of Star Wars, or I remember this from being a kid or whatever, and this looks cool.
Yeah. And I think like it is easy to forget that, you know, would you say like pre-internet, kind of, well, yeah, basically that pre-internet, like, you know, if you were into this stuff, like you were hanging out probably at a comic book store, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And in a way that people, I mean, comic book stores are still vital and still important and stuff, but, you know, not like, they don't have the cultural kind of cachet that they did at that time. You know what I mean? Like the influence and stuff. So for Star Wars to be present and visible, like in comic stores, I think was, must have been pretty important at the time. Like you said, to bringing it back, help them bring it back. So for sure. All right. Star Wars Publishing, 1994. That's everything we're going to cover in most, if not everything that came out at the time. So 5 novels, couple reference books, some more West End game stuff, 4 different comic series. There was a ton going on in 94 and a lot of good stuff. Let's move to games, video games. And we just have 2 that we're going to talk about today. So two that were released in 94. So actually a little more of a light year as far as game releases go.
Both great though.
Yeah. So let's start with Super Return of the Jedi. We've already talked about Super Star Wars and Super Empire, so we don't need to get into this too much, but this is the 3rd in that series, obviously wrapping up that trilogy of games on the Super Nintendo. And I love these games. They are just side-scrolling action games, and really, really impressive visually for the time, I think. Definitely take some liberties with the Star Wars property in terms of making it more video gamey, and I think that's perfect and fun. So I played a little bit of it. I have it. Where'd I put it? Here, I have it. I've got all 3 of these, and I played them a bunch, like maybe last year or the year before when I picked these up again for the Super Nintendo. And I played a little bit of Super Return of the Jedi to prep for the show. Looks like you played a bit too.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can play as Luke, Chewie, or Leia early on in the game, but you can also play as Han later on. You can play as Wicket. You can play as Chewie. So it kind of just depends on like what part of the movie and what sort of environment you're in. And you get to play as different characters. So I think that's a cool feature that is more present here than it was in the other 2 games, I think. All you could play as quite a few characters in Empire 2, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. But anyway, let's see what else You like that mode 7 driving part to start the game? I thought that was a weird opening to Super Return of the Jedi.
It is weird, but I like it.
It's like, hey, let's get players into this game. Let's hook them. Let's start strong. You're in a land speeder, trying to make it to Jabba's palace on Tatooine, but there's giant like gaping like I don't know holes in the ground all over, and you got to jump them. And like. I don't know that it would have been that treacherous just to get to Jabba's palace.
Yeah. It reminds me of like playing a ghost house in Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo, the original Mario Kart, with like the holes in the ground, and they're just like blackness. But yeah,
I guess it's like it's a prologue to the game, but to me it's weird because it's like, well, if you're gonna have a level like that, like have a couple standard levels first so people like know what the game is about, and then throw one of those like bonus levels in.
Yeah.
But to start with it's
kind of hard too.
Yeah, it is kind of hard. This game is very hard also, by the way.
Hard. Yeah.
I was playing on easy and struggling a little bit. So
oh, for sure. And yeah, like in that driving part, like even if you're like almost to the end, if you like fall in a hole or get bumped into a hole, like you have to start the whole section over. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah, yep, totally. After that though, I played as Leia. I don't know who you played as in that second level, but you can play as Luke, Chewie, or Leia there at the start, and you have to make your way into Jabba's palace, which is more what I'd expect in a game like that. And as you get to the end of that level, you fight your first boss of the game, which is, as you described it here in our show notes, the giant check-in eye at Jabba's palace.
Yeah.
The one that pops out to 3PO and R2, and 3PO's like, let's just go. Let's get out of here.
Now he's giant. I'm sure that eye thing has a name.
I
don't know, but
it might be in a guide to the Star Wars universe, but I don't, since it's alphabetical, I don't know how to look it up.
Yeah. I thought that was pretty funny.
Well, it's also just real quick, it's like a great illustration of what makes these games really fun, I think, because it's telling the story of Return of the Jedi, and it's actually pretty dedicated, I think, to like in a lot of ways accurately representing that and like kind of telling that whole story, and like visually everything looks like really cool on a 16-bit style, like from those movies and everything. But at the same time, it is totally okay. These games are totally okay with being like, this is a video game. Let's make it video gamey. So that check-in eye all of a sudden is massive and like a real threat to you instead of just like a camera on a on a stick, but I know some people would probably, I'm sure at the time people were like, that doesn't make any sense, or that's crazy or whatever, and people maybe now would go back to it and say the same thing. But to me, like, that's perfect. That's what you got to do with a video game, I feel like, or you don't have to, but it's a great approach to take, which is just to say, guess what, this is a video game. Let's double down on the fact that it's a video game and make it a fun video game. So I like that.
Something also just like I noticed, and it's really apparent like right in that first side-scrolling level, is like the actual stage design has, I feel like, really opened up, because it feels like and I'm wondering if these games were informed by it at all, but like it feels like a Sonic level, because you have so many paths you can take. Like in old school, like the first trilogy of Sonic games on the Genesis, like you could finish a level in a multitude of different ways. Like there's those levels were so big and open for like a platformer style game, and I definitely get that feeling here. Like you can take a path where you're going to get a bunch of like one-ups, and it may have some different style platforming and stuff, or you can take like the low road where it's different challenges, and I think that's really cool that the levels are feeling so open in this game.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I noticed that as I was playing in that second level, trying to get into Jabba's palace as Leia, like, I'd be pretty high up and then fall and think like, oh no, this is it, I'm dead, but really
Yeah.
you'd see that there was just like multiple kind of levels of the level, like, and then as you fell, it's like, okay, well, I could have been traveling to the right, way down here, or I could have been doing
Yeah.
that like a little higher up, or been all the way at the top. I think you have to be up pretty high to finish the level. But I was definitely happy about that because I was thinking like, okay, I'm falling, I'm going to die. And instead it was just like, it just kind of showed how much there was,
Yeah.
so yeah. Well, I love those games. I love Super Star Wars. Some of my favorite Star Wars video games ever. So pretty solid conclusion, I think, to that series there in 1994. So
Yeah.
let's talk about the other big release. This is definitely the bigger of the two games, the one that's remembered super fondly, and had a huge impact, I think, at the time it came out, which is TIE Fighter on the PC. I'm thinking you were playing this game in the 90s, Ryan, like when it came out. Is that correct?
Not when it came out, but after I did end up playing it. And yeah, it's sequel to X-Wing. It's like arcade sim, I guess would be the way to describe it. It's not like a total like one-to-one sim like a Microsoft Flight Simulator or something, but it's also not entirely just like an arcade shooter. It's not just like Star Wars Arcade. It again, like I talked about when we talked about X-Wing on, I think that was 93, the last episode of this. The games felt like heavily influenced by Wing Commander, which was a series that I absolutely loved during this time period. And like I really got into these kind of games, but they're also they're pretty hard. And which is a reoccurring theme with a lot of Star Wars games, it seems. But yeah, these games are definitely tricky. So I never actually like finished any of them. But yeah, again, just like we're seeing this is kind of the genesis of what LucasArts could do. The video game publishing arm of Lucasfilm, and we saw it in like Rebel Assault, and we're seeing it again here. Just like the really high production values. Like this is stuff that's these are like hardcore PC games. Like these are not games that really couldn't run on any of the mainstream hardware at the time. Like you couldn't have really had an accurate one-to-one version of this on like the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis. And I mean, also just there's so many, like you need like a keyboard and a flight stick to like play these games, basically. Like they were so demanding. And
the button layout, like for the keyboard or whatever, like there are like 40 buttons to remember. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I was just trying to play it this week, and I played a little bit, and it's not really my style of game, because like I don't know, man. It's so kind of simulation heavy. I feel like I don't know if that's the right word to use or not, but
yeah,
you'll click on a mission to do, and some Imperial officer is telling you like, hey, there's freighters coming in to this sector, and they need to all be inspected. So fly by them and inspect them one by one, and,
yeah,
and usually like all of a sudden something will start shooting at you or whatever, and it'll get more actiony. But even when it is, it's like, I mean, I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm not good at the game, so that's probably part of it. But I feel like I would like fly around for like 2 minutes before like finally like an X-Wing or something would like blast past me super quickly, and then I'd have like trouble finding out where it went. And like I don't know, it's just really it's very light on the arcadey part of it, I feel like, and much more. And even like when you click on a mission, if you like listen to or read all of the the text and stuff, you could be there for like 5 to 10 minutes, just like prepping for the mission, like reading about everything that you're going to do and seeing like all the layouts of like the maps and stuff. It's intense. It's a lot. So, but I think again, in 1994, when there was no new movies coming out, and a lot of this, I don't know what you'd call it, like ancillary material, or material in other mediums besides film, was what was keeping Star Wars alive, or like keeping Star Wars fresh and exciting. I think this was, must have been super, super cool to just be able to have this like very deep, very lengthy, like you said, super high production value experience, interactive experience with the Star Wars universe. I know it was huge for people, because these games are still talked about a ton. And like, you'll hear people say stuff like, that's my Star Wars TIE fighter. That's my Star, you know what I mean? Like people loved, and I don't know how long it would take to complete one of these games, but I'm sure people played them for,
that's a whole summer.
Yeah, exactly. Right
yeah. And I think eventually like they'd kind of find the sweet spot, in my opinion, for like these games that like, it's going all the way back to Star Wars Arcade, and then X-Wing, and then TIE Fighters. Like I think they'd kind of find that sweet spot with like the Rogue Squadron games, that made them like accessible to players who weren't like the last Starfighter, like just like regular people playing on consoles and stuff. But yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of games that which was the case with a lot of PC games at the time, like you bought this game and you need to commit to it, like whether it's like an RPG or a sim like this, or a strategy game, like that becomes your life. And that was kind of the expectation with PC games of like this era. And I don't know, there's something like it makes it hard for the games to be like super accessible now, even though you can get these on like GOG or Steam, which is cool. They got them, like you can run them on like gotta commit to them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm more of the Rogue Squadron, kind of guy myself, for sure. But like I said, these games were just hugely important at the time. So I've got a few videos I'm going to post to our YouTube page of both of these games. So if anybody's interested in checking those out, not too much gameplay. Maybe I'll link to another channel that's got some more comprehensive gameplay footage of it. But as I was messing around with the games, I noticed that, number one, the opening cinema is just really cool, especially just to get to like soak up that like 90s Star Wars vibe. Like you really get a feeling of like what was Star Wars like in 1994 for fans who just were wanting to live and breathe some Star Wars but didn't have any new movies coming out. Like it's a great example of that, and it's pretty cool and super high production values, like you said. So there's that, but then there's also just like even within like the menus of the game and stuff, there was is a section where you can go in and look at all the individual Starcraft from the game, and it has like different descriptions of them and information about them and stuff, and you can just like, click through and look at all this. So just a ton of content and stuff. And again, like if you're somebody in 1994 who's loving like reading a book like this, and just like TIE Fighter had a lot to offer in terms of that stuff, even coming from somebody who didn't play it at the time and, doesn't play this kind of game. And like, it doesn't have the same impact on me, this game, that it does on, I think, or that it did on a lot of Star Wars fans at the time. But there's still, a ton of great stuff in there for sure.
Yeah.
All right. So as we wrap up here, let's just talk about a couple other little things going on in Star Wars in 1994. Actually, the first one here, you know what? Neither one of them are little. They're actually both huge, I think.
Yeah.
The first one, maybe not quite as big as the second, but the first bullet point here for other stuff happening in 94 is that the Lucasfilm Fan Club magazine became Star Wars Insider with issue number 23. So, I guess to a certain extent, it's like, well, that magazine already existed, but to have that branding of Star Wars Insider, that was huge for us in the 90s, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think that kind of, signifies the the all hands on deck approach to Star Wars that's coming from Lucasfilm. Because like I don't know what the Lucasfilm magazine was before it became Insider, but I would assume maybe it's like, here's some Indiana Jones stuff, here's some Willow, here's Tucker, a man in his dream. I don't know like
No.
what that would consist of, but yeah, this is like, we are going to be the Star Wars company.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. You're right. And I mean, it does still cover some of that stuff. Like there's still the first, well, not the first couple, but there's a few pages like near the beginning of the issue that's like, here's what's going on with Lucasfilm, like Lucas Arts, and here's what's going on with Indiana Jones, and here's what's going on. Like there's a part where it's like, oh, Radioland Murders is in post-production, and giving a little update on that, you know. So but it's 95% Star Wars. And that's how it always was, like throughout the 90s. Is like, yeah, they'd have some information about indie and stuff in there, you know. But it was full on like Star Wars at that point. So yeah, for sure. And I mean, this coincides with Star Wars getting that bigger push that it's getting in the early 90s. It's like, we're gonna do a Star Wars magazine, all Star Wars all the time. So I was looking through this first issue of Insider again yesterday, and man, there's some great stuff in there. There's interviews with like Carrie Fisher and Dennis Lawson, news about upcoming like Lucasfilm releases and stuff from their licensing partners and things like that, which is cool. Early in the magazine, there's a little column that confirms that the special editions are going to be released in 1997. So this is something that, you know, was announced in 1994. Wow. Still 3 years off. Yeah, but it kind of shows, I guess, that Lucasfilm, like the machine was starting to, you know, get put in motion here.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff coming out in 94, but, you know, they already had their eye on, we're going to put those special editions out in early 97. And obviously those would have taken time to produce. So, you know, you figure like if they started working on those in 94, that's, you know, a little less than 3 years, I guess, to get all three of those movies cleaned up and new special effects and all that stuff. So that makes sense. But the thing that I love the most about going back and looking at this first issue of Star Wars Insider, and really a lot of the issues of Insider, especially from the 90s, is to look at the Jawa Trader section of the magazine, which is this catalog that features all this amazing Star Wars merchandise that you could buy in 1994. And the stuff is so cool because, number one, it all has that like early to mid 90s Star Wars aesthetic to it, which I was talking about earlier, you know, with like the art of Star Wars and stuff. And I love that. But I mean, there's pins and shirts and posters and watches and masks and models, and then also weirder stuff like pewter statues. And I love too, like the Star Wars collectible plates, you know, that you'd like put like in your hutch or whatever. They've got that kind of stuff, and it's like so cool to go back and look at all the stuff that was available then. Fans of Blast Points podcast, no doubt, have heard them talk about the Star Wars, the George Lucas Super Live adventure from Japan. And there is, I don't know if those guys have seen this issue or not, but there's like a whole half a page of Super Live merchandise that could have been easily purchased out of the Star Wars Insider at that time. Yeah, so. It's like what an amazing dream, you know, if somehow like you could just order from that catalog now, you know, like, oh, here's a copy of Insider 23, put your order in for all this
check or money order.
Yeah.
Lucasfilm.
Oh my God, that would be the best. Yeah. So yeah, anyway, Insider, amazing. Ryan, you just recently resubscribed, right? You have a subscription to Insider.
Yeah. I've been picking up some back issues. I've been buying the collected editions or the best of Insider books and reading through those, because man, some of those interviews, like it's so crazy. Like that is like, I mean, that's like an episode of the show on their own. Like some of the interviews and insights from, like, you know, the late 70s, early 80s with, you know, people involved in Star Wars that like were either debuted in Insider or were reprinted, because they did a lot of like reprinting of like compiled interviews that maybe showed up in like another magazine or you know, a newspaper or whatever, a film trade magazine, who knows, like, and that's really cool.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely.
And Insider Now is just, it's a wonderful magazine that it's awesome to subscribe to. You should do it. Lots of Star Wars content.
Yeah, I know I need to. It's just like, oh man, I feel like magazines are just so expensive now in general, I guess, you know, because it's like $8 an issue or something, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's pretty pricey, but yeah, I would love to do that. I'd love to pick up more back issues too of Insider.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But yeah. Okay, last thing, kind of important, pretty big, I guess. Big story in 94.
The biggest.
Yeah. Episode 1 pre-production begins.
Yeah.
And I don't think this was really necessarily announced though, right? Because I didn't see anything about this in like Insider or anything like that. I think it happened, but it's probably still kind of under the radar at this point. I'm not sure. We'll probably find out in 95 that the official announcement comes out that they're working on the prequels, but
that sounds about right.
Yeah. So, but we use the Star Wars. What's the title of the book? The Year by Year.
Yeah.
Book, and in that lists 94 is the year that George Lucas begins writing episode 1.
Drops his kids off to school in November, and then comes back home.
You can watch it happen in the beginning. The most amazing Star Wars documentary, right up there alongside From Star Wars to Jedi and the director and the Jedi. But Doug Chiang brought on as design director as well.
Yeah, and that's what Year by Year says. There's actually an interview with Doug Chiang in the new issue of Insider, and he says that his first like official day was like January 95, but you know, it's still in this like time frame, and like the conversation
continuity error.
Which is canon. Pablo, tell me the Doug Chiang canon.
Maybe he was hired in 94 but didn't actually start work until 95.
Yeah, but like him and obviously the discussions are happening, the script is starting, like, the wheels are in motion, because that's what all this is building to, like the special editions, the Return of the Comics, the novels, everything is building to 99 and the release of episode 1.
Yeah, for sure. And you have here as our last bullet point for our Power of the 90s 1994 show notes, you have a quote here.
Yes.
Which what is this quote here, Ryan? And where is this?
This is what George Lucas told Doug Chiang when he came back to came to Lucasfilm to begin production on the prequels. Lucas said, "Forget everything you know about what Star Wars is, because we're going to start over."
They did that in a lot of ways. They did that with the design of Phantom Menace. Man, that's cool. That's crazy. So George Lucas. You know?
And that's the thing, like, because I think, like, Doug Chiang came in and was so excited. He's like, "Oh, I love Star Wars. Like, this is so exciting. Like, I love, Empire Strikes Back and A New Hope. And like, that's what got me to become an artist and a designer." And then George is like, "No,
can't look like that. No, it's got to look different." Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's, obviously in the prequels and in the Phantom Menace, there is so much very Star Wars feeling stuff. But as far as like the art design goes, like, Naboo and Naboo cruisers and all that stuff, like, they really did push it away from the look of the original trilogy, which, I think they could have maybe not pushed it quite so far away look wise, but, but by the time you get to Revenge of the Sith, I think they got that down. Like, that's kind of to me what like prequel era Star Wars should have looked like. It's still very OT, but it's got a newer look to it, but it's an evolving thing. And Doug Chiang's amazing, obviously. I think you had just texted me recently that he's talking in the New Insider about working on episode 9, or somewhere you saw that he's talking about working on it.
No, it's in Insider in that interview. He's overseeing the art department, like when he came back to Lucasfilm after the Disney buyout. He was like brought in as like an overseer, I believe. But yeah, he's actually like, he's really committed to like staying on top of his art game. So he's actually like working on designs and stuff as well. I don't know if that's like
not just being a manager or whatever, or supervisor,
like
but also being down in the trenches. And
which I think is great, because man, like, I mean, there are some complaints about how different episode 1 in particular looks. But I also like, I think that's amazing, because we have this one Star Wars movie that looks like nothing else. Like, because even into like episode 2, like a lot of stuff started to normalize. I think like that transition, and then by episode 3, like we're basically at like, oh, this makes sense. This is this is before A New Hope. But like episode 1, just there's so many just crazy designs, and it's such like a beautiful film. And I think like, Doug Chiang, I think he designed like the Naboo starfighters and stuff, which are in like Padme's ship as well, like, which are just like the craziest, like, I don't know, like 50s style designs. And I love that stuff so much.
Yeah. And I mean, there was some controversy about the look of Phantom Menace and how different it was, but I think that's all down to George. Like Doug Chiang was creating some really beautiful designs based on what George wanted it to be. And if George wanted it to be more original trilogy, Doug Chiang would have done that. So I think like, he's obviously insanely talented, and has done amazing work in Star Wars, and starting with the Phantom Menace, and then we get to see him do different things post Phantom Menace. So for sure. Although I do remember, because I have to look this up, but I know he left kind of, I think, before the prequel trilogy was over. Like I don't think he was design director.
Yeah, like early 2000s, he formed his own production company.
Yeah, and I think at the time I remember kind of feeling like, oh, well, I like the way that like Revenge of the Sith looks better, than Phantom Menace, and kind of thinking like, oh, well, maybe it's a good thing that Doug Chiang, is not kind of responsible for the look of Revenge of the Sith, because I like the way it looks better and stuff. But I don't feel that way anymore. I feel like it's like George just really wanted it to have like a very unique and different kind of look in the Phantom Menace, and I think that's clear, especially when you see some of the amazing stuff that Doug Chiang has done for the sequel trilogy, and how Star Warsy it looks and stuff. So probably few people who have as much, like he would be one of the heavy hitters as far as like having that total Star Wars expertise, like of having worked with George and worked on multiple eras of Star Wars films and all that kind of stuff. So pretty amazing resource, and I'm glad he's back there at Lucasfilm for sure. All right, well, let's wrap up here this episode of The Power of the 90s for 1994. Packed year, tons of great stuff. We'll keep looking at each year of the 90s, and back next year in 95, and 95 is a huge year. I don't know if we'll be able to fit it all into one episode, because
I don't know. 95, like that's where it gets personal for me. That was my formative year that took me from like, oh, I like these movies, to like, oh, I'm obsessed with this.
Yeah, and an important thing, a very noticeable absence from our list of releases for these Power of the 90s episodes so far is toys. There's no toys on our, and that's going to be back in a big way in 95.
Oh man,
that might need to be its own episode of the Power of the 90s, but we'll see. in any case, until then, you can keep up with us at our website, our blog, which is blockaderunnerpodcast.com. Email us and let us know what you think of these Power of the 90s episodes. We're blockaderunnerpodcast@gmail.com. Still would love some reviews on iTunes, so we could
haven't really gotten any of those.
No, we need some reviews on iTunes. That would be really helpful, and they're not exactly rolling in. So if you're listening, it would be great if you'd run over to iTunes and leave us a positive review. Twitter, we are at Blockade Run. Ryan, you are at Braun Dwarf.
If someone left a review, would we read it on the show? I know some shows do that. Does that incentivize people, or would you not like that? I don't know.
I mean, sure, I'd read them on the show. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, well, you could have an internet infamy, I guess, if you left one. Yeah. Also, another shout out, like I've mentioned it on Twitter a bunch, and if you're listening to this, you probably listened to our last episode, but our last episode about Kelly Marie Tran and Rose Tico with our special guest Laura is one of my favorite things we've ever recorded. And if you're listening, please go and listen to that episode because it's really important and really wonderful.
Yeah, and Laura was awesome to have on the show, so that was really fun. So definitely check that one out. And if you subscribe to the Blockade Runner podcast, either on iTunes or on YouTube,
you already got it.
Yeah, it's going to pop up for you. So hey, if you haven't heard it yet, what are you doing? You got to subscribe.
Yeah, for sure.
So cool. All right. Well, thanks very much, Ryan, for diving into Star Wars 1994 with me today. Can't wait to jump into the rest of the 90s. And we'll be back soon with more Power of the 90s and more Blockade Runner podcast.